Well, the original house is leaving at, no, not that early.
I have not.
2 o'clock.
Do you want me to pull up a picture? Get over here. Let me get onto my social media account.
I mean, I know what the literature says, and you do too. I was saying that. Well, I agree completely.
Dr. Bridges, that you notice the intention and how we organize the well, sometimes we a former student, so they know. You're ready.
Good afternoon. We're back in session and we're returning to the Educator Standards and Practice Committee led by Dr. Olivia Oxendine. Dr. Oxendine.
Thank you, Chair Davis, and I will begin this the appropriate way. I failed to do the right introduction because I wanted to get Mr. Wallace's principals up to the mic, and they did such a fine job again, and I will send them an email thanking them for their hard work, Mr. Wallace. But I am Olivia Oxendine, and I chair the ES&P. Joining me in that responsibility is Ms. Amy White. We will go to the agenda. The first item was already, we already have the new business item. The second item is an action on first reading, and this pertains to the teacher compensation and advanced teaching roles. And Dr. Tomberlin is going to come forward and give us this presentation.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Oxendine. So I am here to present the annual request for proposals for the Advanced Teaching Roles program in the state. I think most of you know this program, but just a brief refresher. So every year on September 15th, the NCDPI issues a request for proposals to the districts where they apply to be a participant in the program, the Advanced Teaching Roles compensation program. And so we're bringing you the request for proposals for this year. There's not a lot of changes, just dates. So you're free to review the RFP. It is in your materials. Here's a slide that tells you what those requirements of the program are. I will let you read that at your leisure as well. There are a couple of interesting things about some changes recently. So the first thing I have to say is this is codified in statute now. This is not, usually we get this in a budget bill, the reissuance of this, but now it's codified in 115C311, and it is a program, an ongoing program in the state. In that, there was the indication that LEAs could apply for a second term of funding at the discretion of the State Board of Education. So last year we discussed this with you, and one of our guidance to the districts are we would prefer you not submit a new proposal unless you're fundamentally changing the work that you're doing in your district. If you're seeking a continuation of that program, then what we would advise you to do is alert us of that fact, and we will give you nominal funding for the next 3 years to support that class size flexibility that is so important to the districts in implementing these models. And so we will continue that with this year's application. There are about 3 or 4 districts that are ending their their funding, and we will reach out to them and offer them this continuation funding rather than having them submit new proposals. Because the districts are very good at writing sustainable programs, so they don't need the startup money necessarily, they just need that flexibility. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have about this.
Any questions, colleagues, advisors? Very good. So that is coming before us today for voting. And so I think you're just going to stay at that point.
Until you run me off, yes, ma'am.
Well, I don't plan to do that. That's not on my agenda.
Very good.
So have at it.
So the next item is the report to the North Carolina General Assembly on the advanced teaching, the teacher compensation models and advanced teaching roles. I already see a correction we need to make. This is no longer a pilot program, so we will drop that word pilot out of this report. This is a required report in legislation. It has a due date of October 15th. However, in the last budget bill, the General Assembly appropriated funds for the evaluation. As many of you know, that budget bill came very late, and we were not able to get the contract and work with a vendor to establish the scope of work in time for 22 reporting. So what this report says is we have gotten the contract in place. We have identified the vendor for the evaluation process. We will not have data until the October 2023 reporting date. But here is, we're submitting the scope of work of that evaluation to the General Assembly and to you, the State Board of Education, so that you know how we're planning on approaching the evaluation of our advanced teaching roles program.
Any questions to my colleagues or comments? I keep thinking that somewhere in the plan, the model to revise, to do the teacher pipeline and rethinking teacher licensure, that somewhere there should be a place for this model.
Yeah.
That's a very insightful statement, because much of those advanced roles in the teacher licensure and compensation model is leveraging the work of this program. And I'm glad you're making that connection. We hope others see that connection. We have learned a lot from the districts about how teachers can take more leadership roles in the school without having to leave the classroom, and we've tried
to. We were wise. I don't know that was in the crystal ball at the time when we moved in this direction of the advanced teaching roles, and it goes back several years.
Yes.
But here we are with an opportunity out of this model, so that's a big win for the State Board of Education and for the state licensure. Absolutely. And I'm not ready to run you off.
Okay.
You have one more important item, unless we have questions about that one discussion item. We're down to ES&P 3. ES&P 3 is also discussion. This is the update. Once again, we're going to hear more about the principal preparation requirements and the licensure requirements, along with some recommendations that we will hear about. And hopefully we'll have a really good discussion around the table about the recommendations. Things will be coming back to us, decide them next month for a final vote. So it's yours.
Well, I am going to defer to my colleagues, Tabari Wallace and Dr. Andrew Seiberg, for this section. Thank you.
Thank you.
So you did run him off.
He did so politely.
Good afternoon, board members. So what we have for you today is some formal recommendations for changes to the principal preparation requirements, and ultimately those are going to be shared with the legislature for consideration to change the law. I'm going to try and do this efficiently. So the first two slides that you see here are a basic background of what has transpired over the past year or so. It basically goes back to the spring of 2021 when we identified that there were some components in the law that were not in alignment with the activity that was happening in the principal preparation field. And then there was some remedies that happened, short-term remedies that happened with some laws that were passed. And meanwhile, we started working on gathering stakeholders to collect information about what would be best practice going forward for principal preparation requirements. So I'll leave the first two slides for you to navigate on your own there to save a little bit of time. What I do want to draw your attention to is this slide here, which is what we're bringing to you is the first bullet, which is we're trying to get formal recommendations to go back to the lawmakers, and that needs to be completed by October of this year. And that's so that they can do their work around reflecting on what the board's recommendations are going to be, and then ultimately having that go through the process of the adjustments to law if there are adjustments that they feel warranted. But that is only one of three things that are actually going on in the principal preparation world that we thought it would be really important for board members to be aware that there are two other things that are going on simultaneously. One is we're also in the process of updating policy related to principal preparation. And some of that is contingent on these recommendations and whether or not the lawmakers make those changes or not. But some of them have to do with just there's not enough specifics in policy around principal preparation. And so we are actively working with a variety of stakeholders that you'll see mentioned in a couple slides down around the alignment of the new standards, the principal-only program requirements, and what should be required of those programs should they stay in effect after the lawmakers consider some of these recommendations. Requirements around the internship. I know there was a nice presentation this morning on the internship process and best practices from the field, so you have that important information. You'll be getting some additional information on that once it goes through Pepsi. There's also some requirements in policy that are being considered around what should be in the portfolio itself. So what are the specific expectations in the portfolio? And then lastly, we're trying to get all this done by the end of the latest law, which is in place that is waiving the expectations that are in current law until August of 2024. So that work is ongoing. It takes a while to do some of this because of all the stakeholders that we're navigating. But our goal is to get that policy tightened up through the Pepsi work and ultimately for your consideration in time to meet the end of that waiver period. The third component that's ongoing is updating the principal standards. This has been going on. Our dear colleague, Dr. Robert Sox, who has recently retired, was championing this work around the state. But basically, he was taking the existing North Carolina principal standards and trying to align those standards, which have a couple of years on them now, with the professional standards for educational leadership or leaders, which is the PECL standards, as well as the NELP standards, which is the National Education Leadership Preparation Standards. So trying to get all the latest and most current expectations of principals and the best thinking around the country around principal preparation and incorporating that into the principal expectations, as well as maintaining what North Carolina thinks is most appropriate for its own needs within its own state. So, and that work currently is actually at a point where it's being piloted in 8 districts around the state right now. So we're in the process of collecting data on that, and that work is ongoing as well. So today we're focusing again on that first bullet, which is the formal recommendations around potential adjustments to the law. The next 2 slides show you the various stakeholders, and you've heard me present, and Tabari as well. We've presented a couple times as this has developed over the course of the past 6 months or so. But these are the stakeholders we've leveraged in this conversation, beginning with the Teacher Recruitment and Retention Task Force. We gathered information from them about this topic. We also, you heard from folks from the Principal Advisory Committee this morning. They were a part of this thinking as well. We also heard from NCACTE, which is the North Carolina Association of Colleges and Teacher Education. That's sort of the support group around the state for all the ed prep programs in our state. And then on the next slide, we also gathered evidence from deans and program leaders in July to get their perceptions. We heard directly from the principal or the Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission, and lastly, we heard some feedback from DPI leadership as well. So with that, what we're going to do next is I'm going to hand this over to Tabari to give you the recommendations formally. But what you're going to have in front of you is a series of similarly laid out slides. The first slide is going to be around the current law, which will be it will be bold for you to see what we're actually trying to address, and then we'll provide the formal recommendation. And we also have in there the various stakeholder input if you'd like to look at that in greater detail. But Tabari, if you can walk us through that part.
Sure. Thank you, All right. Good afternoon. All right. So, again, we're going to go through all these. I'm not going to review the stakeholder feedback. I think we've presented on that 4 separate times already. But I will be here for any questions if you have any questions regarding those slides. But for 115C-284, B1, okay, to qualify for the certification as a school administrator, an individual must meet all of the following requirements. Number 5 was pass the exam adopted by the state board. Here is your feedback, okay, and the recommendation is as follows. Discontinue the licensure exam requirement. Include an evidence-based portfolio, which is the common practice that we're doing today. Okay, next slide. Okay, the State Board of Education shall adopt new standards, and I'm reading this, y'all, on purpose, okay? Shall adopt new standards by July 1, 2008 for school administrator prep programs. The new standard shall, number 7, require all candidates to complete a year-long internship. And as I stated before, the internship range was 500 to 1,500, the 1,500 being TP3 or the North Carolina Principal Fellows. Our recommendations include year-long internship, a minimum of 10 months, and that needs to be language added to the law. Define year-long internship and what it entails in policy. Okay, and we, as you heard before, we say that it's 2 semesters. That should include 2 semesters, and the range that we recommend is 500 to 1,000 hours. Okay. 115C-284D1. All right, prerequisites. The law states that we should have at least 4 years of classroom teaching experience and possess at least a master's degree in education administration. Our stakeholder groups differed a little bit with this particular bucket. So we're definitely looking forward to the discussion. Our recommendation is require 4 years of work experience as a licensed educator, including teachers and support personnel such as school counselors, media coordinators, and or social workers. For D1, next slide.
Mr.
Yes, ma'am.
Wallace, I apologize for butting in, but would you go back to the previous slide? Because I think this one on the requirement around, the current requirement
Yes, ma'am.
around the 4-year classroom teaching requirement, which is in statute. If we could look at the
previous
breakout of feedback
Okay.
from
Yeah,
the
right.
stakeholders.
Yes, ma'am.
If you could walk us through that.
Okay, the Teacher Recruitment and Retention Task Force, which is largely our HR specialists across the state, they recommended that we give 4 years of teaching experience. And this one did not include the other license area in education.
Excuse me again, and I believe somewhere in the documents I have read that superintendents make up, we have some superintendents that make up that group as well, I believe.
Yes.
So HR directors.
And some superintendents, but they're largely HR directors. Okay. The Principal Advisory Group recommended 3 years of teaching experience, and they did include social workers and the and other licensed areas. In CACTE, included everyone as well, as far as counselors, social workers, and teachers. EPP deans was interesting. Once we talked to them, they're pretty much split down the middle. 7 of them said that the one at classroom experience required, and then the 8 said that any educational experience, and when we say that, y'all, we mean, again, social workers, media coordinators, or wraparound service type personnel. Pepsi said 4 years of experience with licensure area, but to include the support service personnel like counselors and social workers. And DPI said 4 years of experience as licensed educator, but also include the teachers. So there was some variation in these stakeholders. The other ones were pretty much lined right up and pretty much unanimous, but this one is definitely going to be some discussion with everyone assembled today.
Are there any questions? This is an important frame. Each one is important.
Yes, ma'am.
But I want to draw some attention to this one. So actually, Pepsi and CACTI, Pepsi and NCDPI is basically saying being a classroom teacher is not required as the basis for, as a prerequisite to becoming a principal. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
While we're on this, before we move in, can I ask one more clarifying question on this?
Sure.
What is the situation right now if a school counselor wants to become a principal? Do they still have to have had at some point in their career 4 years of actual classroom teaching experience, or how do they thread that needle right now?
Right now, their experience counts. As a counselor, if you've had 3 years of counseling experience or 4 years of counseling experience, then they can apply. If it's a master's in counseling, they can apply for the add-on license. But if they don't have, which is unusual for counseling, but if they don't have a master's in it, then they can actually go the MSA route and attain their degree that way.
The current requirement, and I would need to go defer
To look
Dr.
at it.
Tomberlin.
Mhm.
I see Dr. Tomberlin. He stood up and then he sat down. I'm not making you. You can come.
was adjusting.
Oh, okay. You were prepared. You were getting prepared. You should be preparing to run. But I stand to be corrected on this. In order to be a school counselor in North Carolina, the requirement to be a classroom teacher, there is no requirement to hold a teaching license in order to be a school counselor.
Yes, ma'am.
Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
So, and I'll speak from my experience only. We have school counselors that have come through the program at Pembroke, the MSA program, without a teaching background. And that's a decision of the graduate school, not necessarily of the MSA program, but the graduate school. So as far as the school social worker, the licensing there, I'm not sure whether a school social worker needs to hold a teaching credential in order to be a school social worker or not.
I don't think so.
You don't?
I don't think so.
No, ma'am, they do not. Student support specialist licenses do not require an underlying teaching license. I do want to clarify the question that's at hand. So if the question is, can a school social worker qualify for a principal license, that is not allowable by law, but the waiver that we currently have in place is allowing that to continue until August 31st, 2024. So, and then everyone who preceded that from 2010 to 2020, the statute waived that requirement permanently for them. So for their current license and for all future renewals. So those folks from 2010 to 2020, they're fine. They don't have to go back. Whatever the law says moving forward, they're going to be fine. They're going to be grandfathered in. But these folks currently we're doing this under the conditions of the waiver that was instituted last legislative session.
So without some kind of adjustment like we're looking at, or like is being recommended by some of these groups that does include people who are not teaching in a classroom, their pathway to being a principal would, if we didn't change this wording, their pathway to being a principal would be sort of shut down. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
It's not a large population, but it is. I mean, but that's true
Okay.
of most of the things you're seeing here as well. The 4 years even is waived under the waiver. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Ms. White.
Thank you for that clarification. That helped.
So I'm my query about this particular discussion has to do with I'm wondering how teachers will feel about having an administrator participating in the evaluation process for that teacher's pedagogical skills in the classroom, their classroom teaching skills in an evaluation, and they're being evaluated by someone who has never taught. And so how are we reconciling that, and was there any discussion about that from these groups?
So part of the reason that the department is recommending, as we are, is with the assumption that some form of the Pathways to Excellence plan will be put into legislation sooner rather than later, and that one of the goals of that plan is to provide relief to both teachers and principals, such that teacher leaders who are strong instructional, strong pedagogy leaders will be doing those teacher evaluations, because that system of a principal and or an assistant principal completing a whole school's evaluations is untenable. And any honest principal will tell you that it rarely gets done the way it's supposed to get done. And I mean, I've got personal horror stories about that, as do a lot of teachers. And so we, in a more ideal world, our principals will not have 50 direct reports. There will be a more distributed type of leadership model that will take some of that instructional burden off of principals and distribute those tasks amongst teacher leaders. And so therefore it shouldn't matter. I mean, to be honest, my first supervisor was an assistant principal who was the band teacher. Now, everyone knows I love band teachers. My dad is a band teacher, but I did not, that was not a good observational experience for me because I was a high school English teacher. I do feel that, I'll just put this out there, but that's, to me, is not the same thing as, oh, I'm a high school English teacher and a physics teacher, or this principal who used to be a physics teacher. This physics teacher doesn't know English. No, good pedagogy is good pedagogy. Amen. And you don't need to know the subject area. But I will say that being an art teacher, or being in my opinion, or being a music teacher or a PE teacher is different than, it's a very different proposition than a classroom setting. That's just my opinion. But bottom line, when we made this recommendation, we're thinking forward to Pathways to Excellence.
Other comments? Yes, from our principal of the year.
I think that's also where our group saw the value in the portfolio, is that you can demonstrate a proficiency to learn those skills prior to holding that job. So having been a high school teacher myself, luckily I've been a high school administrator. That was an easy walk for me. If you put me in elementary school tomorrow, I have a lot to learn. Yeah. And so I would need to demonstrate those proficiencies before I can fairly talk to an elementary teacher and give them that feedback. So I think we would ask those same things, that those people demonstrate the ability to have that talk and understand that pedagogy and understand that instruction at that level, no matter what their background is from.
Okay, thank you. Other thoughts? I've been an assistant principal, and I've been a principal. So I am talking about this from firsthand knowledge of what it means to be an instructional leader. I understand the role of lead teachers. I understand the role of instructional coaches. I understand the role of going to the department chair or the grade level chair and say, help me with some evaluations. I need a peer evaluation. The bottom line, the buck stops with the principal. The principal is the person who signs off on that evaluation unless the law changes and makes that different. The buck stops with that principal when it comes to knowing how to hire a strong instructional coach, what to look for in an instructional coach, what to look for in the person who is going to assist me in conducting evaluations. You can hear in my voice that I am a firm believer that the person called the principal of a school needs to understand firsthand what it means to have been a classroom teacher. We would never, I don't know the world of medicine, but I would venture to say a person who is promoted or named chief of surgery would know something about how to operate on a person, how to perform surgery. I would think that individual knows how to set up a surgical room. I compare that to a classroom. I would think that that individual would have the sensibilities to know if the classroom teacher is struggling with small group instruction. Sure, you're going to have an instructional coach somewhere in the building who can come in and answer a question and demonstrate a lesson. But that principal must have the credibility and be perceived by his or her teachers as having the first-hand knowledge and credibility to get it instantly. I understand how you're struggling with small group instruction. I remember the same struggle as a first-year teacher. We have several stakeholder groups who are leaning heavily in the direction of the classroom teacher experience. The teacher recruitment retention group, I think, is unanimous. We're talking about HR directors who hire teachers, who are involved in hiring principals. They are in support of the classroom teacher. We have superintendents who are part of that group. I don't know how many, but obviously the data says to me that they also are in favor. We have the deans. They're split 7 to 8, but their voice is very important. I'm very glad that we brought them in as a group of stakeholders. So that particular part of the recommendation to the General Assembly is still in question. So it's really going to be left up to, and I need to clarify this. I know you're probably saying maybe you're too involved in this discussion, but let me clarify this point. I am fully in favor of a school counselor seeking the credentials to be a principal. I am fully in favor of a school social worker who wants to seek the credentials to be a principal. But I also believe that that individual will better serve the school and the students and him or herself with a classroom teaching credential and experience. And someone has his hand up.
Hey everybody. I have an administrator in my school who was a counselor, and he's one of our assistant principals, and he's magnificent. And something that he brings to the table that classroom teachers can't is the ability to counsel with people. He has a magnificent ability to talk to students and to get to the root of why behaviors are happening. And that's something that a classroom teacher does not have the expertise in. And while I agree, I think it was very difficult to get buy-in when this gentleman came to our school, because teachers were thinking what Dr. Oxenine is saying. How does he know? How do I know that he's going to evaluate me properly? We were worried about that, but he proved himself to us through his genuine seeking out what it really means to be an educator. What does it mean to be a classroom teacher? And he listened to our voices. And what I love about the portfolio here is that they have to prove all those competencies. They have to show that they have all these different knowledges before they can come in. And so it gives me hope that anyone who seeks out, especially in this model, I went through a portfolio process when I got my master's in school administration, and I'm so grateful that it wasn't a checklist, because I learned so much through the reflection process when I was doing that. So it was amazing. But I'm grateful that he is our school principal. So I think that there's definitely both sides to that, and I agree with you. We were all very worried, but he brings so much to the table.
Absolutely, I'm sure. Absolutely. The richness is there.
Oh, absolutely.
Added dimension. Okay, moving. moving right along.
Very good. Okay, and just for your reference, I had Dr. Peter Martin pull up the evaluation rubric just FYI for your own general knowledge, if you wanted to peruse that to see what we're required by law to evaluate teachers upon. Okay, that's the 6 standards. Okay. All right. Any more questions before we go to the next slide?
Any other questions? Okay, we'll move along.
Okay, the next slide is D1. The prerequisites must have attained at least a second level of differentiation in regards to the 4 years of classroom or educational experience. You must possess at least a master's or go through the MSA program at an accredited EPP. Okay? But the law says a second tier. We're going to define it as required masters of school administration, which we call an MSA degree, or required an add-on licensure program if they already hold a master's in their current content area. So, to summarize, for number one, we recommend to discontinue the licensure exam requirement, but we want to include an evidence-based portfolio. Number two is to include a year-long internship, minimum of 10 months. And again, this language needs to be added into the law. Number three is to require 4 years of work experience as a licensed educator, and that is to include teachers and support service personnel such as school counselors, media coordinators, / social workers. And fourth is require a master's of school administration, we call it MSA, or a master's degree in your current content field, and then go through the principal licensure add-on program to get it added on to your current license. Those are the 4 buckets. Any questions?
Yes, Chair Davis.
So I really appreciate the conversation about educational experience, but I'd like to go back to number 1, where it seems unanimous that we want to do away with testing. And we're all products of our life experiences, and I'm no exception to that. As a professional engineer, I had to take 2 tests in order to become a professional engineer, and neither one of those predicted whether I'd be a good one or not. They were purely a minimum standard of knowledge and skill to inform the public that I met that standard and therefore could practice engineering. Then it was up to me to become an effective engineer working under the tutelage of another engineer. I'd say the professions in our society, like engineering and law, architecture, medicine, accounting, on and on, that I believe we aspire education to at least equal, if not exceed, those professions. Every one of them requires a minimum standard of competency to enter the profession through a test. Now, I also had to submit my experience, so there was a portfolio element to it. But at the end of the day, it was about passing the test. That's right. And I detest some of these standardized tests that our kids have to go through as a parent. I detest, so I have that experience to draw on. But, and I know we want a test that will predict who's effective. I don't think they exist. So I may be in the minority on this issue, but I do feel strongly that a test that informs the public of a minimum standard of competency and knowledge is an inherent credibility issue in a profession. Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree.
Thank you very much.
As a point of personal privilege, Dr. Oxendine,
Sure,
I'm from the old school. I took the test, and I had to do the portfolio to get through the MSA. Dr. Jordan took the test. I think my score was higher than his. But, we've done it already, so I agree, though, that the test is not a predictor of effectiveness.
That's your rehearse.
Yes. Thank y'all. Good.
Dr. Oxendine, I've got a couple questions.
I hear someone.
Ms. Campbell.
Ms. Camden. Yes, Ms. Camden.
So, Tabari, first to you. I'd like to follow up on a couple of things there. First of all, could you help me understand? Chair Davis referred to a basic level of competence. Is that what that exam measures? What does that exam measure? I mean, help us understand a little bit more about what that exam does.
Well, the old exam, when we took it, I'm not giving my age, but it pretty much was a review of what we learned in class, and I think it has some vignettes, some things that you had to look at, a lot of them. And we had to go through scenarios they threw at you and how you would adjudicate or respond to that stimuli. I mean, that's all it was, but it was a 99 or 98 point something % pass rate that we had. That's why the discussions were beginning to surface about the discontinuing of the test. The test was $450. And this was back in 08. Okay, so imagine what it'll be today. So that was one of the burdens on the students coming out in such a high pass rate.
What is the pass rate now?
We don't take it anymore. We're on the port.
So we're not currently using it.
Okay, let me add, because we have not, the state board did not select an exam. There was no
This is
need
one
to
of the,
set
okay.
a cut score.
Right.
All right, so am I hearing from you, Tabari, that these recommendations that we're getting from all these groups to drop to not go back to requiring the exam is based on the cost and the high pass rate, that it basically, I don't want to say that it was meaningless, but in some ways, when you've got that high of a pass rate, it's a pretty low bar. Is that what you're saying?
Dr. Austin down is shaking. Go ahead, Dr. Austin, that was your response.
We don't, Ms. Kamnitz, we don't even have a current body of research on a pass rate for principals because we haven't given an exam in years.
Since 2010.
So that's that. I think the reason.
So we don't know.
I would look to Dr. Seiberg, Dr. Tomberlin to weigh in on this. I really don't know why we don't do an exam.
So just a little historical context. Back in 2008, when the test was eliminated by state board action, and at the time the rationale was, I think it was 2008, 2010, somewhere in that interim. The rationale was that there was a 100% pass rate. Literally no one was failing that test. And in speaking with some people who were part of that conversation, their opinion on this was that it was more of a test of endurance than a test of skill or competency. And that was the rationale that led to the elimination. On the question of do we have any recommendations for a cut score, most states do still administer a principal licensure exam. And we would do like we do with teachers, we would look to the national norming around that. So Praxis largely tells us what's the national norm on the cut score, and then states make a decision whether they want to go a standard error lower than that or a standard error higher, but they give us information on what the nationally normed average for those cut scores are. So there would be information. I'm certainly not trying to direct you down a path. I'm just letting you know that for that national assessment, there would be a nationally normed cut score that the vendor would provide.
And we'd be in uncharted territory just because we haven't administered the test in so long. We wouldn't have any idea.
So this would be similar to any other situation we have in North Carolina where we adopt a new test. There's no historical North Carolina data that we can use to inform that cut score. We use the national norming provided by the vendors to establish that, and then we monitor in the state as we implement it within the state.
Thank you, Dr.
Okay.
So I'm not asking a rhetorical question. I'm truly asking because I don't know the answer. If we go down a route where we have both a licensure exam for principals and a portfolio, how can we square that with eliminating licensure tests for teachers, which has overwhelmingly been the recommendation in order to remove barriers to licensure?
I'm sorry, that's for me. So my response to that so technically what we're doing with teachers is providing multiple opportunities for demonstrate that competence. Teachers could still choose to take the licensure exam if that's what they chose to do, but we are offering additional avenues for them to demonstrate their competency to hold the license. With this in particular, it seems to me that the question of the portfolio comes up, and then that has to have its own standards and its own review to ensure that it's meeting quality standards for the state. My initial thought there would be if you link that portfolio to a performance-based assessment, we're talking primarily about a standardized assessment for principals, but there are performance-based assessments out there for principals that portfolio could be the leverage, that could be the information that's collected to serve the completion of that performance-based assessments, and then you've got some synchronicity between what's being asked in the portfolio and that ultimate test. You're putting that portfolio collection up against a nationally normed assessment of those types of portfolios.
So I guess that my question would be for those who feel that a licensure test is necessary, would what you just described fulfill that requirement of a minimum standard that lets the public know that you are prepared for this role, for this job?
So that's tough for me to answer because I don't know kind of the public's perception of what's more credible, a performance-based assessment or a standardized assessment. Like, do people think the ACT is better than, a demonstration of performance? That's hard to say. But I'm just trying to think of the way that portfolio could be. I'm trying to find a solution to both sides. Like, can you have a situation where the principal process is portfolio-based and performance-based, and can that lead to this external validation that the principal has met those competencies? And from my perspective, a performance-based assessment might be able to solve that problem.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom. I guess my point is that if we're going to say that we're doing away with tests that create a barrier for one group, then why is that not true for another group? We can't have it both ways. So we need to think about that as we're making decisions moving forward.
And I agree with that. And if that's the goal, then the internship is the place to look for those ways that you can incorporate competency, other ways to demonstrate the competency to hold the license in lieu of an assessment would be my thought on that.
Any other, Ms. White? Yes.
So
Yes, Olivia, and Olivia, after Amy, I've got some follow-up questions.
I'm reflecting back on Chair Davis's comments about the degree of professionalism and the elevation that we give to leaders in education across our state. And do we have any type of data that suggests that people don't seek out being principal because they have to take a test? Do we have data that suggests that the only reason that they wouldn't pursue being a principal is because it costs too much to take the test? And so if those are perceived barriers, then what I would suggest to you is, back to Chair Davis, when you complete nursing school, you take nursing boards before you ever practice as a nurse. When you, as an engineer, you take the PE before you ever practice. And it is when we talk about paying for professionalism, and when we have leaders in charge of students and employees, we're the largest employer across the state. Businesses, there shouldn't be the hesitancy of a baseline expectancy with some sort of exam in addition to the portfolio. These are big responsibilities. I don't want to see us 5 years from now looking at the same number of low-performing schools because we didn't put a high level of expectations on the folks that we're placing in those leadership positions. And so it scares me to think that we would say, we don't want to give the test because the people who want to be principals don't want to take a test. And we don't want to give the test because it's expensive. Every other professional person that has to take a test has to incur that cost at their cost.
Thank you. And I think I heard Ms. Kamnitz.
Yes, I do. I do have a follow-up. And I'm just sort of following along with behind Superintendent Truitt. My mind has done the same thing as hers, which is go to what we are doing or thinking about teachers right now. And I have to throw something else into the mix that we haven't talked about, and it may be understood. I just haven't seen it. But one of the things we're talking about with teachers is whether they opt to take the Praxis or whatever standardized test or not, there is still a continuing requirement to prove in some way that you are an effective teacher. And certainly, just because you pass as a teacher or a principal, just because you pass a test right in the beginning before you've actually started the work does not mean that 5 years down the road we know that you're going to be effective. So I would like to see in this some kind of recurring evidence on the principal's part that their skills have grown, and that they continue. It's not just a one-shot deal. You pass in the beginning and nobody ever comes back to examine whether you're an effective principal or not. Are we thinking about that?
It sounds like what I'm hearing from that is maybe adding a bit more vigor and rigor to the continuing education requirements for educators, including principals.
Mm-hmm. And we're currently paid on our effectiveness as well.
I have to just play devil's advocate here for a second. So I'm very familiar with the PE exam, and I mean, if you look at the number of boards and commissions we have in our state that monitor, you have to have a license to do nails in this state. I mean, to do massage. I mean, there's all kinds of things that people have to take an exam in order to do. I don't know that, I think passing an exam that allows you to practice that profession, that is a very standardized exam across professions, is to me different than what we're talking about with teachers and principals. The only standardized assessment we have is at TPA, and that's not even done in all states. And so I just am putting out there that that I don't know that, to Ms. White's point, I don't know that we're saying that we shouldn't give the licensure exam for principals because it costs too much or because it's time consuming or for fear of tests. I think what we're saying is that this whole conversation came to be because it had a 100% pass rate and because it wasn't seen. There were better ways of showing preparedness than that paper and pencil test. And so I guess what I'm saying is that I don't know that it's a good comparison to the fact that engineers have to take, I mean, that's a very well-known exam. Mm-hmm. Medical exams are very standardized across, that's not what we're talking about. And I just think it's a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison. And but I do agree, I think one thing that we're all on the same page about is that there needs to be some clear demonstration, not just once, but ongoing, of proficiency and effectiveness.
Yeah, so if there's a portfolio in the beginning, then every 5 years perhaps you update that portfolio and it has to be reviewed and approved again or something to continue to have your principal's license, which is what we're asking of teachers. Every 5 years they have to find a way to prove that they are making a difference in classrooms.
You're segueing to a very important topic because the direction this board takes in terms of these recommendations is going to also require that the board direct the agency to build out things like the internship, which is not clearly defined, to require the department and other stakeholders to build out this portfolio that we keep talking about. Right now, there is a portfolio. It's made up of 6 evidences. In most cases, I don't want to pretend to know everything about what EPPs require in terms of reviewing and assessing these evidences, but what I would hope that this board would do is to require an external assessment of the portfolio, because right now I would imagine faculty members who assign the evidences are the individuals who score the evidences. So we need to bring other eyes to these evidences. If we go with these evidences or add evidences to the portfolio, we need to have, because this is getting to the heart of rigor, we need to have an external review of these evidences. Now, that is going to take time, and that is going to take money on the part of EPPs to do that. But these are the things that we would have to build out. As if we dispense of the exam, then these are the pieces that would have to be built out. Other questions?
I would contend that they'd have to be built out whether we require the exam or not, because an exam in the very beginning is not sufficient. Something has to happen continually through the career.
That's true. You're right, Mrs. Camden. Other questions or comments? This is coming back next month for final
vote. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. That concludes. I'm sorry? Another question?
I think, this is Mrs. White, I think we have had great discussion. But it scares me to death to think that we've had this dialogue and we would be ready to vote again with a whole month, and maybe you can talk about, so what is, can you help me with timeline? And although there is an urgency in getting this work done, I think there's consensus around the table that we really want to get this right. And so I'm not trying to kick the football down the field. I'm just telling you, what's the drop dead date? Tell me what the drop dead date is, so that maybe we have an opportunity for, you guys have discussions in committee, but it then gets brought to us, and we replicate some of those conversations that you've already had.
Right.
But I'm not sure that I feel comfortable making a yes or a no vote on this next month.
From my understanding, October that's why we said to vote in October. And again, that's so we can get ready for the long session.
Okay. It's being driven by the legislative ask.
I don't want to just say it's October. I want you to understand why it's October. So the long session has to take this work up. This is long session work, not short session work, because we're talking about fundamentally changing the rules around principal licensure. So the General Assembly has indicated to us that they need this on the front end of the long session, the 2023 long session. So we're trying to get our recommendations in order to get that met in time. And the reason it's so critical is the waiver extends to August 31st, 2024. That sounds like a long time away, but folks enrolling in a program, when they enroll in that program, need to know the requirements to hold the license at the beginning of that program, not once they're halfway through it. So that's what's causing the pressure around this, to get it to the General Assembly so that it is one. We want to get it on the front burner as early as possible, because we know as the legislative session goes on, things get different, priorities shift through there, and we want to try to get this nailed down as quickly as possible. And I think, so to some of your questions, I think what's critically important is we have the big pillars around these 4 questions that we've brought to you. They don't have to be exactly hammered out, because we don't want to put very specific requirements in statute. We want the general requirements in statute, and then the board works with Pep-C to develop those specific policy recommendations, such as, are there other ways to demonstrate the competency rather than a test? Those kinds of questions, I mean, for the legislature, could be as general as principals shall exhibit their competency before holding the license, something like that. Then we can work with policy to say, well, is that performance? Is that how does that look moving forward? So I hope that helps.
It does. It doesn't mean I like it, but
well,
yes.
That's kind of my thing, is to tell people they don't like, tell people things that they don't like.
With that, we'll run you off, Dr. Thomas.
So I do see a hand to my right, Vice Chair.
A very, very quick comment. We referred to some of the professional requirements. So I'll use mine as an example. As a lawyer, I had to pass the bar exam. I don't know any lawyers who look back fondly upon those days getting ready for that exam or taking it. But one distinction after that, I've had a license issued every year by the state of North Carolina. I've kept all 43 of them, actually. Started at $12.50 a year, it's up to $50 a year. That allows me to practice law. And I don't have to do any portfolio, and I don't have to do any interim reviews. I need to make sure I, at all times, comply with the rules of professional conduct set out by the state bar. So there's the one distinction here is there is a competency test at the front end for these professions, but I don't think many of these professions have, other than taking CLE courses in my case, or that don't have ongoing portfolio reviews or other competency reviews of the type that are described as part of this process. So there's not a complete match between the two professional experiences, and we should just keep that in mind as well.
Okay, 39 states require an exam of principals. 41 states require teaching credentials and experience prior to being a principal. I will just end on that note. And I agree with my colleague, Amy, who vice chairs this committee, my co-leader of this committee, and say I would welcome a little bit more time so that we could think it through more thoroughly. This is a big decision. It's about the leader of the school. Thank you, Chair Davis.
You bet. So we look forward to that discussion next month. Thank you, Mr. Wallace. We'll now turn to Vice Chair Duncan, Chair of the Business Operations Committee.
Thank you. Along with my friend and colleague Wendell Hall, I lead the Business Operations Committee, or we lead it, and we have several items today. But as we begin, I note that it's 2 o'clock and our start time, our end time was 10 minutes ago. Okay. And I want to compliment in this light Ms. White, who usually has a considerable period of time with her committee and did it less than 5 minutes today. Mm-hmm. So for once, I just want to say Ms. White and I are not the problem.
Okay, so who is?
No more than that. We're not. We're just saying we're not the problem. So, and I won't do it in 5 minutes, but I think we can go pretty quickly through here. On BizOp 1, which is one of our 3 actions on first read, is approval of contracts over $500,000. We have the Collier contract, Collier Technology Solutions contract relating to our child nutrition. Lynn Harvey's here to give us a very quick review of this contract.
Thank you very much. Very brief. This is a request to extend an existing contract with the Collier Technology Solutions Company, the proprietary owner of our software that powers the school nutrition program throughout the state. Last year, we were given a 2-year contract extension period. This request is to exercise our 2nd year. The contract is as it was in prior years for maintenance and support of the system. There is no change in cost or scope as we go forward. So thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. Any
pleasure.
questions? Not hearing any, thank you. Important contract for the smooth functioning. All right, we now go to BizOp 2, which is Esther 3 funding. John Kiefer is going to provide a report in which updating us on where we are with Esther 3 funding and a request for authorization with respect to some funded activities. And this will be one of our longer reports, but John still promises to make the unknowable knowable in a prompt fashion.
I will be as efficient as I can.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Today, Finance and Business Services would like to present an update on the ESSER 3 grant. As you all know, under the American Rescue Plan Act, a state that receives ESSER 3 funds has 1 year from the receipt of the grant to award all of the funding under the grant, including the funding reserved at the state level. For us, that date will be September 13th, so we're bringing an updated plan to the board for approval that'll help us meet the requirement for the feds. The plan is permitted to change after the 1 year date. We just have to have a full accounting by the 1 year date that's been approved by leadership. So it's probably fair to call this an updated rather than final budget plan for the ESSER 3 grant. We had a full plan in place through the end of the fiscal year 22, but in the past 6 weeks, we have had some funding become available. We had some charters close at the end of last school year that had previously received ESSER 3 funds from various grants that had to return those funds. We had a few of our late grants where we had less interest in the programs than the full budget. And we had some reversions from the teacher bonuses, which expired June 30th for funding that was not used by public school units for those bonuses. And we have identified some excess admin funding from the 0.5% that DPI was permitted to reserve for admin. And so we are bringing to the board for approval in order to fully account for the entirety of the ESSER 3 grant requests for an additional $9 million in funding. We have several initiatives that we are proposing, we're requesting approval for. The first is for additional support in the form of 8 additional FTE for the Office of District and School Transformation. This is $2.5 million that will fund those 8 positions through the end of September. And it will bring the total number of FTE for DST funded through ESSER 3 up to 28. 20 were previously approved by the board at past meetings. These staff will work closely with districts to help them improve outcomes for students and to continue to respond from the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our next one is for DPI COVID-19 mitigation. This request is for $200,000 to allow DPI to purchase and install equipment that will help us prevent the spread of COVID-19 within the building for our staff to work on site. The proposal will include purchase and installation of things like touchless plumbing, touchless soap dispensers and paper towel dispensers in the bathrooms, water bottle filling stations, the types of things where especially as we get into cold and flu season, you might see increased infection transmission. So that will hopefully help keep DPI staff safe and healthy as we move forward. Our next one is for Dpi Telework Support. This is $400,000. Like most employers, DPI coming out of the pandemic is finding itself having to transition to an increasingly hybrid and remote environment. And in order to ensure that the staff that are transitioning to those work schedules have the supplies they need to do their jobs effectively, we are requesting funding from ESSER 3 to be able to purchase computer monitors and other IT equipment that will allow folks to effectively do their jobs at home and away from their normal workstations. Our next request is for DPI's AIM conferences for fall 22, 23, and 24. This funding totaling $1.2 million, which is $400,000 per conference, will be used only to support the portions of the conference that are planned to address the mitigation of learning loss due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Our leadership anticipates that will be a significant portion of the conferences for the next several years. And so we are requesting ESSER 3 funds to be able to provide support to the provision of those conferences. Our next request is for the AP Accelerator Program. This is an existing professional development program for assistant principals. It's currently funded from federal Title II funds. At the moment, it only is able to support assistant principals in high needs schools as defined under federal statute. This funding would allow us to expand the program to include assistant principals over the next several years from other schools, non-high need schools that want to participate from the program. It's been very positively received to date, and we feel like utilizing these funds is an important opportunity for a broader range of assistant principals across the state. And then finally, the last item is for principal retention supplements. In the most recent budget, the principal salary schedule was updated to utilize the school year 21-22 student growth scores, or school growth scores, apologies, when determining placement on the salary schedule. Based on the data that we have, this would result in salary decreases for approximately 15% of our principals across the state. And so we are proposing the use of $4.5 million to basically serve as retention supplements, salary supplements from the period January 1st through December 31st, 2023, in recognition of the fact that those principals were still facing unusual and complicated circumstances through the pandemic during school year 21-22. And so to ensure that we don't experience large-scale staffing transitions with salary changes during 2023 calendar year, we are proposing principal retention supplements to help make up for the funding that they would otherwise not be receiving through their placement on the updated salary schedule. A couple of things we did want to highlight at this point. We do have the expenditure data for all of our COVID funding available on our website. It's updated monthly. We have two different tools that folks can utilize to see how the spending is going for the grants, including, as I said, including this starting all the way back to the CRF funds, which were our first funds back in April of 2020, which seems like 10 years ago now. But a whole lifetime of the full lifetime of the COVID funding. You can see all of the expenditure and distribution of funds across the state. And we do have a data visualization tool that will provide different ways of exploring that data and drilling down into specific information. As part of the other thing to emphasize is, as part of this request, FBS is requesting approval from the board to be able to fund board-approved items, these items as well as any other board-approved items from ESSERs 1, 2, and 3 from the oldest available funding. As we are working to close out the ESSER 1 grants, which end September 30th at the end of this month, and as we make progress in executing the initiatives that are already approved from ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 over the next 12 and 24 months, as funding might become available, we would like approval to be able to fund the already approved items from the oldest available funding in order to minimize reversions, but also to be able to free up additional ESSER 3 funds for consideration for use by the board.
All right, so the request here is for these allocations to be made for these items, and that we also approve mechanically that they're taking from the soonest to expire ESSER funding or CARE funding.
Yes, sir.
Making to assure we use all of those funds, and obviously making sure these things qualify. That's what is before us. Superintendent Truitt, did you want to make a comment about the principal retention supplement at this point, which is before us?
Thank you for the opportunity. So we, as the board may have read about in the past week, the legislative change that was made to change the way that principals' performance pay, which is separate from their bonus pay, was calculated. While that may have benefited a lot of new principals, it was to the detriment of some of our more veteran principals who, in a normal year, would certainly receive that pay performance added on to their base salary because they would have met growth. And so really what principals needed was a hold harmless provision. And the legislature indicated they were willing to consider that, but it wouldn't be until December. And so because we didn't want them to spend the first half of the school year wondering if they were going to receive a $12,000 pay cut or even more, the team and I acted quickly. We learned that using COVID relief dollars for principal retention was an allowable expense, and that we could use that $4.5 million to hold that 15% of principals impacted harmless. So big thank you to Patrick Green for working on this with us and calling it to our attention in the first place at the board meeting this time last month.
So
a much bigger thank you to you all for finding a solution that's timely for us. So thank you very much.
Absolutely.
So a couple things on this. This item has been pursued by the department, and again, I want to reiterate thanks to Patrick Green for raising the issue. He lifted it up at our last meeting right away as a concern, and appreciate the superintendent of the department for working on this. This is brought about by, in essence, a change in the rules in midstream by how many years were factored into the consideration as to how the bonus would be calculated. It moved to just 1 year, and it had been best 2 out of 3, and so it was a substantive change without, essentially after the fact of the years. It causes this to be a particularly compelling reason to do the right thing in this way. This is for 1 year, and our hope is, and I think we would want to support as a budgetary item, that we would be asking the legislature to fund this to the extent we need additional years for this waiver in light of the pandemic interruptions as we evaluate that we would also bring it to the legislature's attention with respect to the effect it had, which I'm sure was intended to be important for brand new principals, but also had a kind of common negative effect for long-term principals. So let's just keep that in mind for our legislative program. So with that background, are there additional questions or comments? Yes.
My comment would be that I will seek to leverage the expertise of our principals to determine whether the long session is an opportunity to revisit the entire compensation model. Is 2 out of 3 really the way the principal? I know we've got some perverse incentives with principals who are in low performing schools, and that I know Mr. Wallace talks about frequently. And so I think it would be an opportunity for this board and for DPI to think about, do we want to recommend something else, or do we want to return to the best 2 out of 3 years for growth? So I look forward to hearing your thoughts on that.
Look forward to the conversation.
Very good. Yes.
Yeah, just want to say thank you to Superintendent Truitt. Certainly as superintendents, it made our life a little bit easier to make sure that our principals were going to not have to worry about that or think about that at this time. Look forward to further conversation. Thank you,
Dr. Bridges.
Thank you, Superintendent Bridges. All right, any questions or comments on this item? As you can see, it is an important item, and it's being responsive to real needs. Thank you. We now, John, thank you, John. We now move to Biz Op 3, Lindsay Sight. He's going to present on Digital Learning Initiative Grant, request for approvals. And in this light, I will remind everyone that one of the outstanding presentations we saw this morning included support from the Digital Learning Initiative Grant. So this work is important, and we had a great demonstration today of how important it is.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ashley McBride. I'm the Digital Learning Initiative Consultant for DPI. It is my pleasure to bring for you approval of additional 2022-2023 Digital Learning Initiative grants. These grants have been in place for the past 5 years and are meeting the goals to integrate technology into instruction and improve student learning. Data has indicated that the Digital Learning Initiative grants have impacted how educators think and design student learning experiences. I'm now going to turn this over to Lindsay Sipe. She's the Southwest Regional Consultant and DLI Grants Manager, who will share more about the PSUs being recommended for approval in their proposals.
Good afternoon, everybody. We are pleased to present the list of additional PSUs that we're recommending to receive Digital Learning Initiative grant funding. You may recall that we came to you in June for the 2022-2023 school year, and we brought you a recommended list of PSUs for our 3 new DLI grants. After Dr. Ashley McBride and I did coaching, one-on-one coaching with some additional PSUs that were ranked very strongly, but maybe not quite as strong as those that we originally accepted. We were both very excited about the potential for adding those PSUs to the DLI grants and the additional impact that would have across the state of North Carolina. Today, I'm just going to spend a few minutes diving into those additional grants that we would like to recommend. So for the emerging technology grants, you can see the top grants are in white and blue. The bottom 2 grants are highlighted in green. We would also like to add Duplin County in the southeast region and Wilson County in the north central region to the emerging technology DLI grantees recommendation list. Duplin County intends to extend their school makerspaces with digital media production equipment, and the main focus of this proposal will be to expand the skills of collaboration, communication, creativity, and critical thinking skills for their students. Wilson County Schools is prioritizing their district strategic goals to develop, implement, and share activities that integrate STEM curriculum and digital teaching and learning standards together. And then we'll skip over this, and we'll skip over this for the sake of time as well. And then on this slide, we are again looking at the green PSUs that we are hoping to add to the professional learning mini grants. That includes Roxboro Community Schools, Alamance Burlington School System, Duplin County, and Moore County Schools as well. So Roxboro Community Schools has proposed enhancing knowledge and building capacity for professional learning based on best practices in blended learning, while adding the digital learning standard for students components as well. They've already established a group of teachers that are going to lead this work for them. Alamance Burlington is working to sustain some positive momentum that they've spent a couple of years already building up as well. As they are working to create blended learning classrooms with a lot of great integration that they've already built and started working on as well. Duplin County Schools is proposing coaching and PD that will be designed to improve instructional practices for blended digital learning standards and STEMA personalized learning environments for their students. And Moore County Schools has proposed developing computer science and digital learning standards blended together and integrating that into their ELA math, science, and social studies curriculum as well. And finally, we can skip over this one. I saved the best for last for you, Mr. Duncan. I am so thrilled that in adding these new DLI grants, we will be across the entire state in every region with DLI grants. So we're very much looking forward to seeing the impact across the entire state in every region of the state of North Carolina.
Thank you. So the recommendation here is that the state board approve the 6 additional digital learning initiative grants for funding. Are there questions or comments on this request? All right, thanks very much for the report.
Thank you.
That brings us to Biz Op 4, which is an action item. We discussed this at our last meeting, but this is the report to the North Carolina General Assembly on exceptional children funding. This is a relatively small funded initiative. It was $27,000 to make recommendations with respect to the best approach for funding for exceptional children needs. Matt Hoskins, I think, is scheduled to report. I don't see him immediately.
Sherry's here.
Oh, Sherry.
Well, I'm here instead.
And so as you go through this, there's, and we talked about this in the committee meeting, this is a relatively quick item, but I do commend a brief discussion of items 3 on page 1, item 3 on page 1, and then the Medicaid reimbursement issues, item 5 on page 2, because I think they are of some ongoing significance to various board initiatives.
Sure. So, Vice Chair Duncan, we're glad to be here with this report. We do have on the call that's going to present this 2 of the investigators from RTI that did this study, did this research, and have compiled the report. So we have Dr. Jay Feldman and Kevin Jordan, and I think Kevin's going to start.
Yeah, thank you all for the opportunity to speak today about this work. I think we can move to the next slide, get started. So, in this project, we examined different options for special education funding and made recommendations. Specifically, we investigated 5 areas of interest set by legislation. Among these were how other states fund special education, the benefits of funding based on disability category as opposed to the service level students need to succeed, how to set levels for the different categories, and recommendations for the Medicaid reimbursement process. The report we submitted contains details on all 5 areas of interest because in the interest of time, we'll just focus on presenting findings and recommendations for areas 2 through 5. So for areas of interest 2 and 3, we found that although the way states fund special education varies widely, special education directors in other states and national experts noted that the field is moving towards models based on service level. A funding model based on services provides a direct, more accurate accounting of the cost involved in providing supports for students, whereas disability categories don't always correspond to the services students need to succeed. For example, 2 students with autism may need very different supports with different associated costs. Based on these findings, we recommend that DPI continue the development of a funding model based on service level. Previously, DPI collaborated with the Friday Institute to develop a prototype matrix for a service delivery funding model. This matrix provides funding categories and a student-centered starting point to build on. Please note that vetting the matrix and the associated cost was not part of the scope of the work for this project, but the overall structure of the matrix aligns with the service level funding approach. We also recommend that DPI use CATS data to monitor special education implementation to make sure that students are not over-identified or placed in high-cost funding tiers. Additionally, complementary training on best practices for placing students in the least restrictive environments could help ensure appropriate identification and eligibility determination. For area of interest 4, we found that there's no one-size-fits-all process for determining funding allocations. States have pieced together what other researchers have called a hodgepodge approaches, with varying funding levels for different categories. The best approach is one developed by policymakers, community members, and practitioners that takes into account the unique context of the state's educational structures and financial policies. We recommend that DPI review and update the matrix previously developed with the Friday Institute. DPI could revisit the matrix to ensure that it accurately reflects costs at the district level and fits within the reality of the overall funding available for special education in the state. Additionally, we recommend a pilot test of the funding model and a representative sample of PSUs to ensure that it is feasible. And so for area of interest 5, around Medicaid, we found that the administrative effort involved in Medicaid reimbursement can be a barrier for PSUs, especially for charter schools. We also found that North Carolina already employs best practices, such as having a Medicaid specialist at DPI available to support PSUs. Medicaid billing could be further supported by expanding the eligible services, such as by adding transportation and expanding the age range to birth to age 21. Additionally, technical assistance and training could be more targeted with additional data sharing on Medicaid utilization at the PSU level. Finally, to provide additional support to charter schools, we recommend that DPI continue their efforts to provide training to help charter schools develop a process for reimbursement and ways of collaborating to share costs. That is it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Just to highlight two of the items of 3 and 5 that are, I think, important to us. In item 3, we're talking about looking at miles based on service level as opposed to funding for actual services provided. And so there's a model difference, and there's one of the concerns that's raised, it's partly in analyzing this report, is whether or not that could lead to over-identification of students in high needs, high cost categories. And we, of course, are always concerned about, and the department is extremely concerned about, proper identifications to provide the right services, if you will. So some of the thoughts here are very important in terms of what method we choose, and if so, how we monitor that method. And on 5, just as a quick overview, we at some point in the state had not overall not done as good a job on recovering Medicaid expenses for which the districts would be fully entitled to recover. There's been significant improvement over that. And I think the report points out there's still room for additional improvement, in particular if some other services were brought into the Medicaid umbrella, if you will, for reimbursement. So those are, just wanted to highlight those points, but Sherry, you may have more to say.
I'd just like to add one point about the charter school billing. So yes, until the 21 budget was approved, charters were not allowed by statute to bill for Medicaid. And so that was a huge gain for charter schools and for those personnel that are supporting students that may be Medicaid eligible. So they are just now starting to really go through training. Our staff is working with the Office of Charter School to help train charter schools in that whole process of Medicaid billing. I think we will see that increase as they are able to build capacity at a charter level. You have to think about a school training someone to do Medicaid billing, because that's in essence what happens. But they are engaged, and we've had really good participation across the state. We've offered training. We'll continue to do that from our Medicaid experts, and like I said, in collaboration and partnership with the Office of Charter Schools. So I hope we're going to see some shifts there for some of our charters. I think they could get some additional benefits from that billing.
Very good. Any questions or comments on this?
This is awesome. Woo-hoo.
Thank you.
Yeah,
we're excited. We hope the legislature will now take a look at this, and then I'm sure there will be follow-up from this, but at least it gets a report in their hands that does support some options.
We were on a short time frame and modest budget, but I think we've got a lot of valuable input here, and I think we need to keep this input in mind as we go forward in terms of what we try to implement as policy.
Yeah, I would agree. RTI did a great job of gathering the information and turning it around quickly for us, and we were appreciative of that partnership.
We are very appreciative of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, now we're going to pick up some real speed. BizOp 5 certification of finance officers, and these are all consent items now. And on this particular item, we have happy news: 2 new CFOs to report for certification in Winston-Salem, Forsyth County Schools, and in Halifax County Schools. BizOp 6, a report to the North Carolina General Assembly on State Agency Mobile Data Report. This is an annual report required, in essence, that it follows our use of mobile devices in the department. BizOp 7 is report, and there's nothing out of the ordinary in this report from other years. BizOp 7 is report to the North Carolina General Assembly on State Board waivers of state law rules granted to local education agencies on class size requirements and school calendar start dates. So on class size requirements, you will see from the report there are a considerable number of schools, and it goes by school in multiple districts where there are some class size requirement waivers that have been granted. And then you will also see a report with respect to start dates. It's important, and I think Allison Schaefer would appreciate our defining what our role is on the school calendar dates, because we all see that there's some reporting indicating there's real concerns, in some instances some controversy about that. Our role is and what we were authorized to do is to report in this report what the start dates are. Some of those start dates may or may not be in compliance with what the state law is. If there's, we would go so far as to write a letter to remind the districts of that. We have no enforcement authority beyond that. So I just wanted to help clarify for us what our role is. And so we carry out our role in that we notify the General Assembly, we send out letters to those that may not be following what the law appears to require, and then at that point our level of enforcement authority has ended. So at least at this point with the status of the law. For those who have that question, it does get asked sometimes. And I'm sure Ms. Schaefer will correct me if I misstated that in any way. Finally, Biz Op 8 is our report to the Governor, North Carolina General Assembly about ensuring security of student records. Obviously a very important obligation. That's an annual report, and that report is in your materials. We have updates on contracts with respect to executed contracts and planned contracts. Have not heard any questions on those for this month. And then we have our monthly budget report, which everyone had available to them, and I have not heard any questions or inquiries about this to forward to staff either. So with that, I told you it would end fast. We're finished. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We complete our report.
Thank you, Vice Chair Duncan. Excellent. All right, we're in the home stretch, team. There are 2 items in the chair's report, and I'll call on our general counsel on the first item. This concerns a discussion of new independent hearing officers that we had in closed session and the need for the board's consideration of appointments to those offices.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very briefly, the State Board has the obligation to provide independent hearing officers in several kinds of situations. One is the statutes regarding career dismissal of career teachers, of which we still have quite a few, when there are dismissal cases and the teacher requests an independent hearing officer. We have requirements in our charter school contracts to give charter schools who are being recommended for revocation an opportunity for a hearing and either in front of a hearing officer or some independent panel of hearing officers. And then we have recommendations, federal requirements that we provide independent hearing officers when we're terminating federal grants. And there may be others, but those are the ones that have come up recently. And we have had traditionally a panel of hearing officers that has been on our website for a long time, especially was developed for the career teacher dismissal panel. But we are down to only 2 folks that are actively hearing cases at this point, so we need to augment that. So I brought you and I've provided information about 4 individuals, all of whom have more than 25 to 30 years experience they're all lawyers, and that's who we normally provide for these hearing officers. I want to make sure that it's clear this is not the Athletic Association group of hearing panels that are supposed to be school administrators who know high school athletics. These are lawyers who can help with a legally compliant due process procedure, independent from the board and DPI. And I'll give you a list of 4 individuals. Ken Sue, who is recently retired from Tharrington Smith, who has over 35 years of experience in education law. Cynthia Grady, who used to be in-house counsel for the Pitt County and Asheville City boards, who is also retired and working. Both of them are working of counsel in firms, but are generally retired. Ms. Grady's firm that she's of counsel to also represents charter schools as well as school districts. David Hostetler, who used to teach and be the head of the legal advocacy program for the Principal's Executive Program before it was closed in 2019, who has a school law practice primarily representing charter schools and is also a professor at Appalachian State in the Graduate School Department of Education. And Kim Church, who is a former partner in a law, well, she's an attorney who's still practicing law, but has 35 years of litigation representing plaintiffs, and her specialty is more in the general litigation area, but she has done some special ed work and some other work on behalf of school districts, but she's also represented, been in advocacy for children and done child abuse and foster care matters for children. So we think this gives us some really, really strong, all of these are very strong attorneys that have been in this this work for a long time, and we would strongly recommend them to be added to our list of hearing officers. And remember, the party, it's usually either the state board chairman appoints it or the parties get to strike folks out and select who they want, so.
Thank you, Ms. Schaefer. Any questions? Okay. Colleagues, I'll bring your attention to item 3D, which has the supporting document to Ms. Schaefer's presentation. And I'd also add my thanks to these 4 fellow North Carolinians for their willingness to serve the students and educators of our state in this important work. The second item, colleagues, it concerns our policy to select board leadership, which is customarily at the September meeting in even numbered years. Because this year we combined our planning, we rescheduled our planning and work session to September, seeking the board's approval to postpone the selection of board leadership until our October meeting. This would require that the board waive policy 006, Rule 3, election of chair and vice chair of the State Board of Education until the October 6, 2022 State Board of Education meeting. Any questions on that request? Okay, then that will move to our agenda item in just a few moments. Okay, so that concludes the chair's report. Board members will now vote on any item requiring action from your committee reports. A thorough discussion and report was provided on each item, including any respective consent items. I remind you that any item on the consent agenda is primarily not complex and may have come to the board for discussion in a prior month. I note also that board members have seen these consent agenda items for at least a week, and so at this time I ask if there's a request to remove any item from the consent, action, or action on first reading agendas. Hearing none, I ask for a motion to approve the following. Approval of the meeting minutes for the following meetings.
40 to do exactly. Hang on just a minute, I have to vote. Motion, Treasurer Falwell.
But we're not there yet, Treasurer. Give me just a second
I'm
to read
doing the best I can
request
over
for
3
motion.
days. I'm sorry.
Thanks for being available. So, seeking a motion to approve the following. Meeting minutes for the following July 29th, 2022 called meeting of the North Carolina State Board of Education's Business Operations Committee. The August 1st, 2022 called meeting of the North Carolina State Board of Education. And the August 3 and 4, 2022 State Board of Education meeting. And then from your committee work, SLA 1 through 3 and 10 through 11, EICS 1, ES&P 1, HRS 1, BizOp 1 through 8, and the limited license and initial professional license request discussed in closed, and the approval of the independent hearing officers as presented by our general counsel. And finally, the request to waive SBE policy 006, Rule 3, election of chair and vice chair until an October 6, 2022 meeting. Is there a motion?
I move the motion.
Motion by Dr. Oxendine. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by the treasurer. Any discussion on this motion? Dr. Petrie Martin.
Dr. Oxendine.
Yes.
Ms. Kamnitz.
Yes.
Mr. Keenan. Mr. Hull. Dr. Tipton Rogers.
Yes.
Ms. White.
Yes.
Mr. Blackburn.
Yes.
Mr. Ford.
Yes.
Treasurer Falwell.
Yes.
Lieutenant Governor Robinson. Vice Chair Duncan.
Yes.
Chair Davis.
Yes. Motion carries. Colleagues, staff, superintendent, thank you for 3 terrific days of hard work on behalf of our students. We will reconvene in October. Hope you have a terrific September. We're now adjourned. Sure.